This is my new 29 gallon neon Tetra / community tank setup, and this is how I built it. Now this is actually a rescape of my old 29 gallon planted tank due to it having various problems with duckweed and blackbeard algae, with the blackbeard algae being a key point for later in the video. Anyway, I decided to go with a dirted tank setup for this one because it's far cheaper than using aqua soil, and I started by sieving some of the topsoil to try and remove as much debris as possible. This is technically an optional step, but you'd be surprised by how much debris is actually in some topsoil. Due to time constraints, I'll be building this tank over a couple of days, so I decided to put the sieved topsoil in a plastic container and add water. This is another optional step, but it can help remove trapped air from the soil before you cap it with your sand or gravel, and this can help prevent problems later in the process. Next up, I had to debuild the existing scape, so I started by draining the water out of the tank and putting it into a plastic container that I plan to use as a holding tank for all of my livestock. I moved the filter over to the temporary tank to maintain safe and stable water parameters for my fish while they're in here and to keep the bacteria colonies in the filter alive. Next up was the tank heater, as the fish are going to be in here for a few days rather than a few hours, so I need to maintain a safe temperature for them. Then I started to remove the plants from the old scape, and the blackbeard algae was far worse than I initially thought. A lot of the plants were absolutely covered in it, and a lot of them just had it around the edges of the leaves, but some of the plants had already started to melt back pretty badly. Next up, I removed the hardscape, and the moss on here was far worse than it looked with the BBA, and it was absolutely everywhere. Out of all of the plants in the tank, this Bucephalandra kedagang was the only one that I thought might be savable, but in hindsight this was probably a mistake and I should have scrapped it. As expected, the fish and shrimp in the tank were freaking out, so I wanted to move them into the plastic container as fast as possible. It really wasn't too difficult to catch the fish out of the tank and move them over, but the shrimp in here took absolutely ages, and I have no idea how long I was there catching shrimp. Thankfully, after around an hour in the new container and a little food, the fish had calmed right down and they seemed more relaxed. I decided to keep the inert gravel from the tank and use it as a cap and layer for the new scape, as it'll have a ton of fish waste in here that can provide nutrients for the new plants. After a thorough cleaning, the tank was ready to go, and I started by adding a frosted background. Quick note, this is just some cheap privacy glass cover from Amazon that costs a fraction of what the aquascape backgrounds cost, and it seems to work fine. By this time, the soil had been sat in the water for 2 days, and I was confident the majority of the trapped air would have been removed. Although I do have a small trowel that I'd literally used days before, I couldn't find it, so I ended up having to use my hands to move the soil over to the new tank. But in all honesty, it was actually pretty fun and gave me flashbacks to gardening as a kid. I flattened the soil out to form a nutrient-rich base layer, aiming for around 1 inch of coverage across the full base plane of the aquarium. Again, I had to use my hands to add this, but again, it was actually pretty fun to do. Now I know the tank looks filthy at this stage, but it's a very easy fix, and the substrate layers were in place and the tank is ready to go. I did add a little water to the tank to let it work out any trapped air in the substrate layers before I moved on to the next step, and I let it sit for an hour or two. This piece of red moor root will be serving as the main piece of hardscape for the tank, and I think this will work well for an island composition. Even after a thorough clean, I did see this tiny little piece of duckweed in the tank and thankfully was able to remove it. After coming up with a few ideas for the hardscape, I decided to just put the driftwood in there to try a few things and see how they looked, and I did find this a lot easier than trying to visualize it. Once I was happy, I started to add some lava rock to the tank to serve as secondary hardscape pieces. Once I was happy, I glued the lava rock in place, but I did try and factor in where I wanted to place my plants. While I was building this tank, I was also in the process of debuilding my 40 gallon tank, and I wanted to use as many of the plants from there in this tank as possible. This is a mixture of regular cryptwentii, wentii green, petchii and willisii from that tank that I will be using. So I started to add the crypts to the tank, not realising how much punishment these would be taken from my Corydoras, but at the time I thought they looked good. Then I added as much of the Hygrophila polysperma from the 40 gallon tank as I could to this one, placing it towards the back right of the hardscape. After that, I added a bunch of Rotala rotundifolia from the 40 gallon tank, and I put this one to the back left of the hardscape. And finally, I ended up adding some of the Ludwigia mini super red from the 40 gallon, and I put this pretty much in the centre behind the hardscape to add a small pop of red. I added some leftover bulbitis to the driftwood in this tank, as I love this as a detail and plant, and it looks great once it's grown out. Then I added the Bucephalandra Kedagang that I tried to save from the original scape of the tank. After filling the tank with water, I realised I had a problem and the lava rock wasn't heavy enough to hold the driftwood in place. Initially, I tried to just weigh it down with some spare rocks that I had laying around and hope that the wood would saturate and stay in place over the coming days. I found a leftover pot of Taiwan moss from one of my betta fish tank setups and I decided to use it in this scape. After thinking about placement, I decided to add it to the larger branch of the driftwood as my shrimp love having moss in their tank and I've got an absolute ton of shrimp going back in here. Once in place, I added a layer of glue down the centre of the moss to hold it in place, and I know that this looks messy at first, but once the moss grows in, you won't be able to see any of the glue. In the end, I ended up just gluing some Sirius stone to the back of the driftwood to hold it in place so I could move on with the build. After checking the water parameters over several days and consistently getting safe readings, I decided to re-add my fish. My Corydoras went in first as these guys are very derpy and easy to catch compared to my other fish. Then I had the ultimate challenge of catching my neon tetras, who are far faster and more alert than my Corys, and this took ages, but I did get them in. Next up was my honey gourami, who just seemed happy to be getting out of the temporary tank. And then it was time for the chili rasboras that I thought would be difficult, but in all honesty they were surprisingly easy to catch and get into the new tank. Not surprisingly, my chili rasboras had lost their deep red colour due to the stress, but this should come back quickly. I actually took a photograph of my shrimp to make it easier to count them before re-adding them to the tank, and there was actually over 100 cherry shrimp left in this tank. Keep in mind, I only started with around 12 6 months ago. I've gave over 100 away and I've moved between 30 and 40 onto other tanks. Anyway, I'm not sure why I like the look of this clip of re-adding the shrimp, but there's just something about it that I think's really cool of them all swimming out into the tank. After freaking out thinking that I'd lost one of my Corydoras and spending about 20 minutes looking for him, I finally found him chilling behind the rock as if there was nothing wrong. With everything back in the tank and accounted for, I re-added the filter and turned the lights off to let the fish calm down and settle in during the night. By the next morning, the behaviour of the fish was a lot more normal and they did seem to be settling in with minimal issues, and my Corydoras, as always, were busy looking for food. Initially, I used a mixture of NT Labs microchrome, fluval bug bites and Hikari algae wafers to feed this tank, as there's minimal algae and biofilm in here, so I needed the algae wafers to support the shrimp's diet. It's honestly been great seeing my honey gourami out and about getting his confidence back. Until the last month of the previous scape in this tank, he was constantly hiding in the plants after his brother died, and I was actually getting worried, but he's far more confident now. I'm guessing that this is a female or mono shrimp and the other two are male, but these guys seem to settle into the new tank quickly as well. Here's a clip of the tank at this stage of the build, and as you can see, all of the fish are active and they seem to be happy enough settling into their new scape without issue. To me, the scape did still look a little bare at this stage, so I decided to order a couple of new plants for it, but due to not realising Horizon Aquatics had changed their opening hours, it did take a few days for them to arrive. Anyway, I picked up 2 Java Fern Tridents, 1 Anubias Coinleaf, and I finally managed to get hold of an Anubias Callidifolia, because every time I've tried to order plants, this has been out of stock and all of these plants look great and healthy. Rather than glue the plants to the hardscape, I am switching over to the ceramic ring method because I can easily reseat the plants in different areas of the tanks during the initial setup if I don't like the initial look of where I put them. I added one of the Trident Ferns above the left hand lava rock to fill it out a bit. I added the other one to the hardscape to fill that area out as it was looking really bare. I put the Anubias Coinleaf in the back right of the tank on the hardscape as I wanted to add some colour and hiding spots to that area. And then I added the Anubias Callidifolia to the front left of the hardscape so it's easy to see, because I actually wanted to see this plant after waiting months to get it. This is what the tank currently looks like with the new plants added to it, and I absolutely love the look of the tank right now. Things were going really well with this new tank setup, and it didn't take long before I could see baby shrimp swimming around from some of the buried females. Thankfully, the adult shrimp were also molten without issue. That's another good sign that the water parameters in here are fine. My 2 younger Corydoras had decided that hiding under the driftwood was a really fun game, but unfortunately they were constantly pummeling my crypts as I go in and out and some of the plants started to melt. My adult Corydoras have been spawning again too, but this does seem to have calmed down over the last 2 to 3 weeks. The chili rasboras have started to regain their deep red colour again, so that's another good sign that they are settling into the tank and water parameters predators are fine. My neon tetras have decided that they like to hang out in the plant cover of this tank, so it's actually quite rare that I see them all out and about swimming at the same time, but they do seem happy and they come out for food as usual. Unfortunately, the blackbeard algae started to regrow in this tank after around a week or so, and it's just continued to grow from there. Although it may look like my cherry shrimp are eating the blackbeard algae, I'm pretty sure that they're just grazing on the stuff that's actually grown on the BBA. One of my neon tetras had some type of infection and it didn't even last the day once I managed to get it into the quarantine tank, but thankfully nothing else has had an issue with this type of infection. I also noticed these small tumours forming on two of my Corydoras, and I was a little worried, but one of them has had these previously and they usually clear up within a few weeks. I did some research and apparently this is just temporary fat deposits forming on the fish, and it can be common with some types of Corydoras. It's only been a couple of weeks and one of the fat deposits has already faded from one of the cories, but the other still does have theirs, so hopefully it'll clear up soon. So the tank has been set up for around 5 weeks now, and this is it today. As you can see, the fish are all fine, but it can be a bit of a pain to see the neon tetras as some of them do like to hide in the plants. I worked out that it's a lot easier to count the neons at night because their little neon flash shows up through the plants a lot easier, but it doesn't show up on my camera phone. But all 8 of them are still in there. I haven't trimmed the stem plants yet, as I was hoping that they'd help use up as much nutrients as possible and get the blackbeard algae under control. I've also removed the floating plant ring in the hope that the salvinia will propagate and use up as much nutrients as possible to help deal with the algae. I currently have the tank on 4 hours of light per day, and I am just lightly feeding the fish to try and get it under control as well. If I can get the blackbeard algae under control, I will keep this tank set up as it is because I actually really like it, and I'll start another monthly follow along with updates on the tank like I did with the last Hardscape. I think that I might need more fast growing stem plants in here to keep the blackbeard algae under control though, and with the Hardscape taking up so much space, it will be challenging to do with the current setup. I think that the blackbeard algae could also be caused by the aerated water in the tank because it's only really grown on the side with the air stone and the filter, but with this stocking level it's not worth risking the tank without a filter. Now the blackbeard algae isn't actually a risk to the fish, but like in my old scape it just keeps growing and growing and ends up covering all of the plants and then it starts to cause them to melt. This is why I'm considering moving my Corydoras and Neon Tetras over to my 40-gallon tank once I'm happy that there's no infection risk from either group of fish. One potential problem with this is that I did try and carpet the 40-gallon tank with Henolanthium telenum green, but it does seem to be melting anyway and it doesn't seem to be showing any new growth. The tank also has an aqua soil base rather than sand or fine gravel, but I have seen other people keep Corydoras on aqua soil without issue. Then I could move my chili raspboras and honey gourami to my 12-gallon guppy tank and move the guppies into the 29-gallon tank and rescape it as a Wallstad guppy tank, as that's a project I have been toying with. I have had an absolute nightmare with guppies on my fish keeping journey, but I really like the species and I wouldn't mind giving them or endless live bearers one last try in this tank. Anyway, I'm hoping that the restricted photo period and less nutrients will help deal with the blackbeard algae and I'll just be able to keep it as it is. And that brings the video to an end, guys. Thanks for watching, have a good day.